I've spent an enormous amount of time thinking about office ergonomics, computer workstations, how to work with a computer in a way that doesn't just damage your body over time. And a lot of that sort of culminated towards active seating and active positions and treadmill and the treadmill desk style setup and all of these kinds of ideas. I thought I would revisit this because I've discovered this unbelievable bit of science that shows that sitting doesn't undo any benefits of exercise. You know, this idea that sitting is the new smoking turns out to be a load of rubbish. It was a Mayo Clinic article that was not based on science at all. The media picked it up and ran with it. Just everything was misrepresented and blown out of proportion. It's not true. In fact, exercise undoes any damage. There was this huge meta-analysis study, over 1 million people involved, that demonstrates that even if you sit 8 hours a day at a computer, as long as you do that piece of exercise, it makes you no more at risk of any kind of issues than the people who don't sit at the computer for that extended period of time. Exercise undoes any downside to sitting. And once you realize this, you can think, okay, let's just go all in on comfort. Let's go all in on creating a workstation that is positive, and you can spend a long time in there and be productive and do long hours without any kind of fatigue or RSI. So this is where I ended up going down all of these research rabbit holes and pulling this off by building this NASA-inspired zero-gravity workstation. In the 70s, NASA looked in depth at this idea of the zero-gravity neutral body position, the position your body assumes in zero gravity. This is kind of what I've recreated. And what's interesting is actually you can recreate this really quite easily just using a reclining chair. You're pretty much halfway there. If you use the footstool and the reclining chair in a sort of almost fully reclined position, you are pretty much in this neutral body position. Obviously, you're not in zero gravity, so there's a few other considerations which we'll look at. But essentially, you're very close to the position your body would assume in a zero gravity environment. So everything is neutral. There's no tension on nerves and tendons. Everything is in this neutral position. So this is a really good place to start. But I didn't want to sort of just leave it there. I wanted to really make sure I was addressing all of the main RSI sort of risk vectors that are associated with extended working with computers, and there are many. The conventional approach to sitting at a desk hunched over with your hands, you're holding your arms up all day long, you end up, your back muscles you're just not really strong enough to support a sensible posture for the whole day, so you end up slouching and you're putting all of your weight onto your spine and your neck and all of these issues. And of course the conventional keyboard design has so many issues around there that create problems in your carpal tunnel here as a result of the ulnar deviation on a normal keyboard. Your forearm pronation is, again, with normal keyboards, meaning your forearm is under tension the whole day. So I wanted to solve that as well. And of course, I've done lots of work with keyboards over the years, so brought all of that thinking into this. So there are basically 7 areas where this zero gravity workstation mitigates the main RSI problems, the way I see it. The nerve issue is the big one. So this is, I think, probably the first kind of main one that most people who work with computers will probably come up against, some sort of issue as a result of using a conventional keyboard where you've got ulnar deviation, which is where your hands are doing this. Essentially, if you're coming towards the keyboard like this, your hands are like that, and then your forearms are pronated in like this, which there's 2 bones in the forearm. To hold your hand palm down like this requires muscular activation and tension. The bones are crossing over. It's not a natural resting position for that forearm at all. This is solved by using a tented keyboard to keep the neutral forearm. And then obviously if you've got a tented keyboard, you can rotate each half so that your wrist can be in a line here as well. That removes the tension on the carpal tunnel. So when you're working like this, your carpal tunnel nerve in here is not under tension as a result of doing this. That is solved by my setup with the keyboard. Now I'm using the Sval board, but this approach does kind of apply to any split keyboard that you can mount essentially at the front of the armrests on your chair. The only main consideration is that if you're going to an extreme tent like this, for me, I think really you do want almost upright, because that is the neutral position. If you look at this neutral body position, the hands are kind of in this position. So that reduces or eliminates this tension in the forearm. But the problem with that is if you've got a keyboard where you've got like a built-in rollerball, that rollerball has to be captive. I couldn't pull this off with the Voyager because the rollerball would fall out. So you do have to kind of think, okay, what are you going to do for your mouse? And I do think it's important that you have it kind of built into this system, so you're not doing this. This is another one of these ideas with a conventional desk setup. every time you move your arm like this from the keyboard to a mouse, you're having to hold your whole arm up, which, over the course of a day starts to put a lot of tension in your shoulder muscles, your traps that are lifting your arms up to do this. So you want to avoid that. And obviously we have gravity to work against. So this is going to mean gravity is pulling your arm down onto some sort of arm rest. Now, for me with this armchair, the one thing you want to watch is having pressure on the elbow. So I've got a padded section here on the arm, and then almost nothing at all under the elbow, and then the padding takes up again under the upper arm here. My arm is just then in that position on the armchair. That seems to work. It's basically anatomically in a very comfortable neutral position. I'm resting, there's no pressure on any nerve. The main sort of point where that happens is at the elbow here, the funny bone area where the ulnar nerve comes close. I think people that have a lot of elbow pressure onto an armchair can develop problems with that. The other way that your ulnar nerve and your elbow can cause problems if it is a closed angle like this. People that use phones all day with this closed angle in the elbow, that's stretching the ulnar nerve. So to have your arm almost outstretched like this on the armchair is best thing for the ulnar nerve in the elbow as well. So there's quite a few areas where this is sort of the boxes are ticked there, but it does require quite a specific keyboard setup with the rollerballs kind of captive so that you can have that extreme tent. And the Svalbard for me just ticks that perfectly. I'm absolutely thrilled with that in this setup. I've got it on these little magic arms clamped onto the chair armrests. Normally when you're working on a computer for extended periods of time, you're kind of holding all your arm weight up all the day long, and you just have tension here. So it's just your muscle is tense the whole day long, and then you wonder why you've got a really sore, stiff neck and sore shoulders at the end of the day. To remove that, all you have to do is obviously support your arms, and as I've just discussed with the armrest, this setup does allow for that, so you can have relaxed shoulders. And because there's no repetitive movement away from the keyboard to a mouse, this is literally the entire time. The chair I'm using is this stressless recliner. I picked this up off eBay for £100. These things are still sold now, but they're like £2,500. I think to find one of these for £100 on eBay is like the bargain, absolute bargain of all time. It doesn't look like they've even changed the design that much. So you're sort of literally getting, nearly £3,000 worth of chair for £100. Yeah, really happy with that actually as a reclining chair. It seems to work very well in this kind of setup because it's got these metal bars just under the armrest. It's very easy to clamp on the keyboard rests there. So works very well, and then you can just tune that tent and tune the angle and get it exactly in the right place. The next thing that's really important is the angle of your hips. So this is using this chair fully reclined, and you get this really open hip angle. And what happens apparently to your discs in this position is they're basically the same as lying down, almost no tension on your discs. This is really fascinating because obviously disc related issues are a big problem. If you're sort of sat up all day long, you've got this issue where you're fighting gravity all the time. You end up slouching. People end up just slouching like this, which is really not a good position for your spine to be in terms of the pressure on your discs. Obviously being stacked upright all day long as well is more downward pressure on your discs in your spine. So taking that pressure off as a result of this really open, supported hip angle and reclined position is, obviously, hopefully an extremely beneficial way of thinking about this. So the other reason this whole setup works, and I've done other videos on this, is this idea of using a big screen far away. So obviously if you're fully reclined, normally with a smaller screen, you'd have to work out how to float the screen over your sort of stretched out body. For me, all I have to do is put my 55-inch TV exactly, at the end of my feet, as it were, on the wall in this room. And that's perfect. It's the right kind of distance. And this stops eye fatigue. You have a thing in your eyes called the resting point of accommodation. In a dark space, your eyes will kind of converge and focus at a certain distance. Not always exactly the same distance, but it's a good deal further away than most people have their monitors. So to focus and converge your eyes on a normal monitor, sort of 18 inches away, requires constant activity, muscle tension in your eye focusing and convergence muscles. Whereas if you have a screen sort of, over a meter away, it's much closer to where your eye's in a relaxed state. So there's no constant tension on that focusing. There's no demand on the focusing accommodation of your eye to achieve that. What's interesting is I just had my eyes tested again, and there's been no change in 5 years on my short-sightedness there, ever so slightly short-sighted. I don't know when that happened. That was my last prescription. There's no change to that. There's a slight change in the astigmatism on one eye, which I don't think is related to using computers. I put that down 100% to using these big screens, which I have done for many years now, at this distance where my eyes are not under constant tension. I can use this screen all day. I don't have any sense of eye strain or fatigue at the end of the day, which is incredible. And it just works so naturally with this idea of being in this reclined position. Obviously, my feet essentially pushing that distance away from the wall where the screen is mounted, but because it is so big, it then becomes the right size at that distance. So it just works so well. So we're left with two more protective mechanisms that I wanted to explore. This idea of, first of all, using a standing desk is problematic because of this idea of varicose veins. Now, obviously a treadmill desk, which is my approach to this, I was using a standing desk and then I added the treadmill to it to try and mitigate this problem of varicose veins. We know that when you're walking, the calf muscle acts as a pump and helps mitigate against varicose veins, which is pooling of the blood in the veins. They have these one-way valves in your veins, and if the blood is just pooling on those, it puts pressure on those valves. Generally just a very, you don't want that to happen. So walking helps that. The muscles push the blood back up your legs and so on. What helps it even more is being horizontal, having your legs out in front of you. It drastically reduces the pressure in the ends of your legs. And essentially the blood can just flow back towards your heart with no resistance from gravity. This is absolutely fascinating about this setup. I've always wanted to explore this, how can we achieve this? Because it applies not only to standing, but normal sitting as well. When your legs are down, you're sat, your knee is at an angle, your hips are at an angle. These are all bends that encourage this kind of pooling in your legs there. So that's a problem that applies to standing and sitting that is mitigated as soon as you get out into the horizontal and your legs are open, your knee angle is open. There are no kinks essentially, and the pressure is measured to be much lower in your feet compared to when you're standing. So this is another really good thing, but it doesn't stop there. There's this arterial side of things. So in your arteries, so we've talked about veins, this is the arteries going away from your heart. Again, when you're sat and you've got these bends, you have this issue where the shear stress reduces. Now, shear is beneficial. You want the shear stress. It stimulates the cell linings of your arteries. All kinds of beneficial processes happen when you have high shear stress, which is when your pressurized arterial flow can move sort of fast and without restriction through your arteries. It reduces the buildup of plaque in your arteries. This is something you really want to promote. And normally sitting is a real restrictive force on that process. There's a couple of mechanisms we want to explore here. One is obviously being in this elongated position, you don't have the sharp bend in the knee and the hip, so your arteries are much less restricted physically as a result of that. But there are two more mechanisms that you can exploit to promote this shear stress thing, and one is actually just fidgeting. This is fascinating because I often listen to music when I work, and I just move my feet around quite a lot to that music, and of course this is like fidgeting, and this is extremely beneficial for promoting that shear stress in your arteries. So that was fascinating. And the other thing that can really promote shear stress in your arteries is heating your leg. So if you've got a heated blanket or just a big blanket, just keep the warmth in your legs. Don't let them get cold when you're working on the computer. That was another interesting thing that I kind of discovered. And it's just absolutely fantastic to use a computer like this, knowing that as long as I get my exercise done as well, and we'll look at that a little bit more when I talk about the fitness rig, it's not actually resulting in any additional risk associated with this extended sitting. So yeah, really a great little DIY project to set up a workstation like this based on an old reclining chair. Absolutely fantastic.